who has a right to come to the United States?
I believe that everyone should be able to come to the United States. We are always and have been and are still a nation of immigrants. And so I believe that, you know, there is no line. We can let in as many people as we choose in terms of policy. And it's, you know, there's artificial limits set on who can come in, who can't, from what countries and from what countries can't,
right.
Whether they're skilled or not. And I feel like that is abandoning our heritage as a nation of immigrants.
So anybody who wants to come should come. Now, most of those people who do come, the low-skilled ones, are a net cost to taxpayers. They take more in services than they produce. Gotcha, bitch. You know the supply and you know the basic economic laws. So you believe then that taxpayers have a moral obligation to subsidize anybody who wants to come here?
I'm not sure where you're getting those figures from. I've heard different figures. Okay. I've heard studies that say that undocumented immigrants actually provide a net benefit to the economy. Okay. And a lot of these studies that claim that undocumented immigrants are a drain or you know, taking money away from taxpayers or something like that are using kind of biased.
Yeah. Well, you heard wrong, because it's actually not even close between education and infrastructure and health care, food subsidies, housing subsidies. It's literally not even close. Mm-hmm. But the point is, do you consider the effect this has on the rest of the population? You say anybody around the world has a right to come here. You learned that in school and you believe it uncritically. Do you think that everyone else who lives in this country has a right to say, wait a second, we should be able to choose who comes here?
So we shouldn't forget that we're talking about a president-elect
right.
that has pledged to deport 11 million people from this country. And so that's what I would like to keep the focus on, is the tremendous human rights violation that would entail. A deportation force rounding up people who are undocumented, people who have been here for their entire lives, almost. People, you know, we had a person at our rally today who was, you know, who was brought here at 3 months old. And he's, you know, he's undocumented, but he's an American. He deserves to be here. And you know, I
get it. No, I've heard it before. Alex, do you think people have a right to lock their doors? Or do you think they have an obligation to let anyone in who chooses to come? Well, you're saying that the United States has no right to prevent people who want to come here from coming here. And I'm just asking you, does the same apply to us as individuals? Do you have a right to keep people out who want to share your apartment with you?
I think that's not really a direct analogy. That obviously a nation state, a sovereign nation state, is very different from an individual.
Well, it belongs to its citizens, so they should be able to decide who comes in or out. Wouldn't you agree? Gotcha, bitch. Doesn't the country belong to its citizens?
I think.
Hi. Howdy. Fact number 1. Transgender is not a disease. This is not my opinion. This is facts from the World Health Organization and the American Psychology Association. Just like gay people don't have a disease. Fact number 2. Rich kids stay rich, poor kids stay poor.
It's not true.
Out of 1,800 billionaires in the world, 12 of them are black. Where you come from, where you grow up, how much your parents earn, whether your parents were married plays a major role in determining where you
is there a question mark at the end?
Fact number 3, I would just like to remind you that hate speech is not free speech.
Yes, it is.
And my question is, since facts don't care about your feelings, why did you use false facts?
Okay, so none of the facts that I used are false. First of all, yes. No, okay, first of all, would you like the answer? Okay, so the 3 facts you mentioned, you talked about transgenderism. First of all, until 5 minutes ago, the DSM specifically defined transgenderism as a disorder. It defined it as gender identity disorder, now calls it gender dysmorphia, which doesn't even make sense. It says that depression is the actual problem, not the actual gender disorder, which again does not explain why the transgender suicide rate is upward of 40%, and the actual suicide rate for the rest of the American population is lower than 3%. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, you talked about income inequality, and you suggested that all wealth is inherited. This is nonsense. According to the IRS statistics, if you are born into the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States, you will not be one of the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States. 90% of people will not be within 15 years. There's tremendous wage mobility in the United States of America. Plus, there is not a group of people who just sit at the very top and stay there. People move up and down, in and out of the 1%. 1% just defines the line of income. It doesn't define the people who are in that 1% of income. I've been in the 1%. I've been out of the 1%. It will happen to lots of people. People who are older tend to be more likely to be in the 1%. They weren't once in the 1%. What happened? Okay, so that's number two. Number three, you say hate speech is not free speech. It depends how you define hate speech. The only speech that is not free speech is speech that overtly defends or pushes violence. Specifically, speech that is generating violence, right? That's the only type of speech that's not hate speech. If I say things you don't like, that's not hate speech. And if you think that it is hate speech, you're a fascist. End of story.
You say that you believe many people in America believe in your definition of freedom, freedom from coercion. And I might agree with you, but I also believe that many people in America believe in a different kind of freedom, and that is freedom to well-being, a certain level of standards, fair housing, at a good price, education, etc. The other thing I want to say is that the system has built into it the poor remain poor and the rich remain rich, and that is an externality of the system.
It is not built into the system at all. It has never been true. It's simply a false. If you look at the evidence, there is an enormous amount of mobility from one class to the other. In fact, there used to be a saying, 3 generations from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, which reflected exactly the opposite effect. So it simply is not built into the system. On the contrary, there's a great deal of mobility within generations and between generations, and we shouldn't argue on the basis of false factual premises.
That mobility, well, let me continue because I'm not sure it really has an effect on the question. Because it is not immediately easy to become in the wealthy class. There are certain parts of the system which make that virtually impossible for the real person. Now, I believe that this freedom too represents the belief in equality as opposed to liberty. And I wonder, is it possible to build a system based on this equality, which I believe that many people agree in, and would not be willing to sacrifice to the liberty of freedom from?
Well, I'm not going to be able to give a full answer to your question because you've asked a very, very complex question, and so you're going to have to pardon me if I am a little dogmatic. But I only want to suggest that the statements I'm making are not without some thought and reason behind them. In my opinion, a society that aims for equality before liberty will end up with neither equality nor liberty.
Another one.
Well, the problem is twofold here. One is what's actually being taught in certain ethnic studies classes, which tends to be on a myopic focus on the idea that America is a racist place against certain ethnicities and minorities. The second point here is just the giant waste of taxpayer dollars that this constitutes. Look, I took Jewish studies courses when I was at UCLA. There are only 2 reasons that you take a Jewish studies course. The first is to meet girls, and the second is to get an easy A. And that's why most students are taking ethnic studies courses unless they're buying into this radical ideology that really is the basis of all ethnic studies courses throughout America.
Interesting. I had no idea that was secretly the purpose behind the Jewish studies courses. In this class, this professor, Curtis Acosta, was using texts that talk about occupied America, that talk about white people being gringos, talk about, as they said, Benjamin Franklin, who is a racist, and on, and it seems like they were stirring up anti-race sentiments.
I think that's certainly one way to interpret that. I think that the things that you mentioned in terms of the racial attitudes of Benjamin Franklin, or the fact that there was a time in our history where parts of what is now the United States were actually Mexico, that people of African descent, of Latin American descent, of Native American descent were exploited and oppressed at a point in our history, I think those are all factually accurate.
But that's not exactly.
And I think that to move us toward...
But let me just interrupt you just to keep the debate going, because that is less controversial the way you just phrased it than what was actually happening. I mean, referring to white people as gringos, let's start there. Is that appropriate? What if these texts referred to black people by the N-word?
Well, there are texts you read in college that do refer to blacks as the N-word because we read Huck Finn. We read other works of literature that use those phrases. I'm saying that there is a place for doing those things if, depending on the context. I do not believe that these courses are intended, or that this particular professor's intention is to stir up anti-American sentiment. So what I see here in terms of
all right, hold on. I got to get both parties in, so let me give it back to Ben and ask you, Ben, to respond.
Yes, context matters, and ethnic studies courses are based on the basic idea of critical studies. Critical studies is a notion that the typical history doesn't include enough about particular races, and therefore we have to break it down by race. So there's black history, and there's Jewish history, and there's gay history, and there's Latino history. What is anti-American about that in general, as just a general matter, is the idea that America is not a melting pot with a similar set of ideas that undergirds all of Americanism. And that is what is so disturbing about all of these courses.